to the floor immediately thereafter, his head now swimming after striking the hard surface. Ash landed on his feet gracefully after the high jump kick he had just successfully executed and then crouched down low. The other two men looked to see who was responsible for the attack, and just as their eyes landed on Ash, a storm of leaves suddenly flew up to the ceiling and struck the lights above, shattering them and blanketing the hall in darkness. "What's going on?" one of them yelled. "I can't see anything." The other panicked. Suddenly, they saw a small light that looked just like a flame coming from down the hall and the rocket grunt with the loudmouth pointed. "There, whoever it is. Get 'em," his equally loose-lipped partner declared. Just as they took off running toward the light they saw, one of them suddenly tripped and went sprawling to the floor. The other one stopped and turned around to see what had happened just as he felt someone reach behind both of his knees and apply a painful jab right to the most sensitive cluster of pressure points. Crying out in pain and falling to the floor on his knees, no longer able to stand, he barely even saw the fast kick swinging around at his face before it made contact. The force of said clobbering was great enough that it shattered the man's nose, sending blood spraying, just as he tumbled back and hit the wall behind him. The other grunt, who had been tripped up seconds before, got back to his feet and looked in the direction of his attacker. Before he could move forward, however, he was suddenly blasted from behind by a powerful torrent of water and was sent flying down the hall. Unfortunately for him, his travel through the air was abruptly halted by vines wrapping around his neck. This effectively caused his frontward momentum to cease, as if striking an invisible wall, before he was slammed down on the ground. And even though the air was forcibly expelled from his lungs by that one brutal slam, leaving the man gasping, it was to be thanked that his neck had not snapped beforehand. As the grunt lay on the ground, wheezing for air and grasping at the vines still wrapped round his throat, the shadow of a figure standing over him was suddenly seen. Although, before he could so much as attempt to react, a fist speeding down toward his head like lightning drove itself into his face. With that one simple, yet powerful blow, the man's head was snapped back into the floor, effectively rendering him unconscious. Ash, who was still partially concealed by the darkness in the hall not illuminated by Charmander's tail flame, stood up just as he heard someone running up behind him. Turning quickly, he saw the first rocket he had begun the assault with preparing to throw a sidekick at him. "I gotcha now, scum," the criminal lowlife yelled aloud, expecting his sneak attack to succeed. To his great surprise though, the younger and shorter stranger who had attacked himself and his teammates simply leaned back and caught his foot between his arms. Eyes widening in surprise, the rocket grunt tried to yank his leg back, only for the mysterious vigilante to swiftly slide in, tighten his hold and then twist in a violent downward motion. The opposing force in which the hands pushed while the leg was pulled effectively caused the tendons in the agent's hip to snap like a broken guitar string. "Yaaaah!" The man yelled in horrendous pain as he fell to the ground immediately in a kneeling position and grabbed at his damaged leg. Ash wasn't done though, as he spun around behind the grunt and kicked the back of the knee of his good leg. With another yelp of pain as he felt something else give out, the man started to fall toward the floor just as arms wrapped themselves around his neck and yanked up on him. However, just as he was being pulled upward, a merciless chop to the back of his neck sent the grunt crumpling to the floor again. This time, though, he was totally unconscious. Turning around, Ash, still half concealed in shadow, saw the last rocket thug standing up on wobbly legs and leaning against the opposite wall of the hall. His nose was still running with blood after having been broken earlier, and when he saw the partly shadowy figure now slowly approaching him, his eyes widened. "And no. No please. Stay away. Stay away," he pleaded fearfully, though unable to run due to the pressure points on the back of his knees still locked up from earlier. In a fast motion of movement, Ash ran up to the man and jumped high in the air, bringing a swinging crescent kick down upon his collarbone. "Ah!" The grunt wailed in pain as he felt his clavicle break just before he dropped back to the ground like a stone. Unfortunately for him, he had no time to wallow in his agony before Ash knelt down in front of him, his face as hard as flint, and grabbed hold of the agent's black shirt, right above the red R. Showing no mercy but strength that was indeed unnatural for a 10-year-old against a grown man, Ash hoisted the groaning lowlife into a sitting position before slamming him up against the wall. Eyes fluttering open and vision swimming from having his head clobbered, the rocket crony finally got a chance to more clearly behold his attacker. The flickering, ominously low light in the hall, now fully revealing Ash's form due to Charmander's close proximity, caused the man to gape. In his mind it appeared to be a kid, a young kid at that, who had just effortlessly beaten himself and his cohorts, ruthlessly at that. However, due partly to the beating, partly to the pain and partly because of the still eerie way the boy's face was cast in the flickering shadows created by Charmander's tail flame, the grunt became convinced that Ash was somehow more than human. Some terrible deliverer of excruciating wrath and torment. Ash stared at the man with cold, threatening eyes, snapping the fingers of his free hand and silently giving Charmander the command to increase the heat of his tail flame. This caused the dim light in the hallway to become brighter, and as it did, the villainous thief was able to see both Ash, as well as the 4 Pokémon gathered down around him. Pikachu, Charmander, Squirtle and Bulbasaur, all of them looking up at the man with raw disdain and disgust. His eyes widened though as soon as he recognized Ash. Why you're the kid from MT. Moon. You messed up our plans there. He pointed a shaky finger at the young Pokémon trainer pressing him back against the wall. I remember you. The coldly calm young man brushed the finger out of his face and stared at the rocket agent with an unwavering glare. Yeah, that's me. And there are some things I want to know and you are going to tell me. Understand? The grunt laughed mockingly, racked though as it was by his pain. Yeah, what do you expect me to tell you? The boy answered without so much as a single blink or hitch in his tone. Pokémon Land. Celadon City. Operation in Saffron. Talk. Now. The man's eyes went wide again, renewing his fear. How do you know about those things? Ash smirked. You've got a loud mouth. Might wanna be more quiet next time. The agent's eyes narrowed. You aren't getting a thing out of me, runt. Once again he shoved a finger in Ash's face, but, highly unamused and at the speed equitable to a Seviper striking its unsuspecting prey, the boy reached up and grabbed hold of said finger. Then, using the man's own knuckles as leverage, he jerked back on the offending digit and swiftly broke it, right at the joint closest to the knuckle. The grunt went to scream in pain, but his mouth was quickly covered by Ash's other hand. Now, why don't you start talking? Starting with Pokémon Land. He then removed his hand from the man's mouth, but he merely spat in Ash's face. Never. Reaching up, the eerily calm trainer from Pallet wiped his cheek off and then grabbed hold of the grunt's hand again. Seeing the scared look coming upon the older man's face, Ash narrowed his eyes. Don't worry, I'm not going to break any more fingers. The helpless criminal's fear was instead replaced with a healthy dose of trepidation as Ash looked at Charmander. Increase the flame on your tail, Charmander, bigger and hotter. The grunt's eyes became the size of dinner plates this time as his tormentor pulled the white glove off his hand and then went to hold it over the blazing hot flame that Charmander now had burning at the end of his tail. No, wait please. I'll tell you about everything. Just please no, not that. The man finally conceded in a horror-stricken, pleading voice. Ash's expression remained passive and neutral as he pulled the man's hand back from Charmander's tail flame. Though he still kept it near enough to be a clear threat as he ordered sharply, then start talking. The grunt vigorously nodded. Pokémon Land. You wanted to know about it, right? Ash just nodded and the man took a deep breath before continuing. Pokémon Land is on an actual island about 15 miles east from this ship's current location. It's owned by the leader of our organization and fronts as an amusement park, a hot spot for family attractions. He paused for a moment to cough, some of the blood from his nose dribbling into his mouth. It looks just like a theme park on the outside, and it's even earned the nickname, Island of Giant Pokémon, because of the massive robotic Pokémon that were built to roam the amusement park and attract more tourists. They look so real you'd think they were if you didn't work at the park. He paused for a second, nervous to go on. Ash gave a small jerk on his hand, however, nearing it closer to the flame, and he quickly resumed. But like I said, it's just a front. We use the island to smuggle Pokémon we steal to buyers who come in on ships or planes. We do it in broad daylight so people don't get suspicious. The visitors who come to the amusement park never think anything of it because the island is a popular vacation spot too, they just assume it's all part of the business. Between the amusement park itself and the smuggling operation we run out of it, Pokémon Land is one of Team Rocket's biggest sources of income. Ash's eyes flared light blue for a moment at the mention of Pokémon smuggling, terrifying the man as his earlier fear of the boy being inhuman rushed back to the forefront. I don't smuggle them myself though. I'm just a guard for the main control center on the island where everything takes place. I swear. Ash's eyes returned to normal as he reined in his emotions in order to continue the interrogation. Keep going. Celadon City, what's going on there? Knowing better by now to refuse the boy, the grunt did as ordered. Celadon City is where the primary hideout besides our headquarters is located. It's directly underneath of the Celadon Game Corner Lounge. We have agents posted all over the city in disguise just in case any law enforcement gets suspicious. The lounge is also a front just like Pokémon Land. Besides the profit we turn over from the game corner, we also use it as a way to move stolen Pokémon all over the region and even overseas. The grunt stopped talking and seemed exceedingly nervous to go on. Ash merely narrowed his eyes. Keep going. I can't. He shook his head rapidly, knowing how deeply he would be in trouble if his teammates ever found out that it was him divulging the highly important information now being given. I've said too much already. With not another word, Ash tightened his hold on the grunt's hand and shoved it into Charmander's blazing tail flame. Immediately the man went to give a blood-curdling scream as searing pain shot through his hand, all the way up his arm, but Bulbasaur quickly slapped his vines over his mouth to silence him. Against the adult man's wild struggling, Ash knew it had to be the unknown power within him that gave him the ability to keep him in place. However, just before any severe damage could be done to the grunt's hand, Ash pulled it from the fire and slammed him back against the wall again. Talk. He growled menacingly, the man's eyes now glazed over from the immense pain he had endured. The rocket agent slowly nodded in assent, Bulbasaur removing his vines from the man's mouth so he could speak. The game corner is. He breathed in short, shallow pants, wincing in pain while holding his burned hand until he could finally talk normally again. Probably our organization's biggest source of income. Our boss depends on it for a lot of the credits we pull in, and that's why we set up a base there. Ash processed the information he had been told for a few moments and then nodded. What's this big operation in Saffron City I heard you mention before? The grunt's eyes grew wide for the umpteenth time as he rapidly shook his head. The only thing I know is that we have several agents posted in the city scoping it out for something. I don't know what it is though, honestly. Just that it has something to do with Sylph Company. He held his hands up, as if to plead. I'm low tier, I don't know anything of greater importance that goes on inside the organization. That kind of information is only known by the boss, some of our top rocket scientists and the commanders, Zetsun, Elenia and Riken. I've told you all I know, I swear. Ash was silent again for a time before, seeing the fearful sincerity in the man's eyes, he gave one final command. What's Team Rocket doing on this ship? The grunt appeared to be on the verge of passing out but managed to hold on long enough to answer. We got here by helicopter, they're parked on top of the ship. We planned on stealing all the trainers' Pokémon and anything else valuable the other passengers had. We're using a new kind of backpack suck cannon to take all the Pokéballs that the trainers hand over. The three commanders are here too. His words began to trail off as he started to fade into unconsciousness, but Ash slapped him awake again. Almost done. One more thing. How big is your hideout in Celadon and how do you get into the base itself? The badly beaten grunt once again started to pass out, but Ash shook him to alertness just long enough for a few final words to tumble from his lips. Big enough. Need. Floor plan. Back room. Poster. Persian. He then slunk forward, Ash releasing him and standing up as the unconscious thug fell fully over onto the floor. Afterward, he turned to his 4 assembled Pokémon after a few moments of silent contemplation. Alright guys, here's what's happening. We need to get Team Rocket off the ship, rescue any Pokémon they may have stolen so far and get back any valuables they took. Bulbasaur, Charmander and Squirtle, you'll come with me. I'll need your help to beat these guys. The trio in question nodded and gave simultaneous calls of loud affirmation before he turned to Pikachu and knelt down. As for you buddy, here's what I need you to do. Go and climb on top of the ship, then sneak inside the Team Rocket helicopters. If there are any agents guarding them, just use your electric attacks to take them out. He put a hand on his knee. As for the helicopters themselves, I want you to do whatever it takes to put them out of commission. Use Iron Tail to break off the top propellers or fry the control panels with electricity, just make sure they can't be flown anymore. Pikachu nodded firmly and gave an obedient salute and a confident grin. Pikachu. Ash smiled and hugged the small electric type before putting him back down and then standing up himself. Good luck Pi. After watching Pikachu bound off down the hall, Ash turned to Charmander, Bulbasaur and Squirtle. Alright guys, let's go. With another resounding chorus of battle chants from the eager trio, Ash took off in the same direction as Pikachu with his 3 loyal little soldiers following right on his heels. He knew he was leaving behind the sacks full of stolen items that the 3 rocket grunts had been carrying, but presently, his foremost concern was stopping the rest of their villainous team before anyone got hurt. Ash only hoped that they were not too late on that front. As he lay flat on his stomach, still struggling against the goon who was pinning him to the floor, Gary desperately attempted to resist the mighty, sucking force of the vacuum backpacks that the rest of the rocket agents were using to suck up everyone's Pokeballs. No. He cried out helplessly as his very last Pokeball was finally snatched straight from his hands due to the overwhelming vacuuming power of the nefarious machines. However, just as the ball in question went to disappear into the tube-like funnel of the nearest vacuum backpack, a long vine suddenly shot in out of nowhere and wrapped itself around the Pokeball, successfully keeping it from being sucked into the machine. In perfect tandem, a flurry of razor-sharp leaves came spinning through the air and cut straight through the hoses that were connected to the machine trained on Gary. The rest of the weaponized leaves sliced into the base of the machine on the grunt's back and spilled all of the Pokeballs it contained upon the floor. While the agent who was wearing the pack looked down at the severed vacuum hoses and escaped Pokeballs in shock, a sudden blast of water struck him right in the chest. The unexpected aquatic attack lifted the grunt off his feet and sent him flying through the air before, with a painful sounding thud, he hit the floor and went rolling. Everyone in the entire ballroom turned to the source of the sudden disturbance and saw a hazy screen of smoke filling one of the doorways. After several seconds of bated anticipation, on the behalf of both the passengers and even Team Rocket, out of the dark cloud walked Ash, flanked by Squirtle, Bulbasaur and Charmander. It's Ash, Giselle announced in a mix between gleeful and relieved while Misty put a hand to her chest and exhaled a breath she hadn't even known she had been keeping in. Well, it's about time, he kept us worried long enough. The Oranguette fumed in a tone that sounded angry but was merely her way of expressing the great concern she too had been feeling for her friend. Namely when Team Rocket had shown up. I just hope Ash has something up his sleeve. Brock murmured, more concerned than relieved as his squinty eyes noticed how every rocket agent in the room was now staring at the dramatically arrived rookie. Otherwise he's in trouble. Gary himself seemed stunned. What are you doing here, Ash? There was no condescending jeer attached to his old childhood's friend name. Now was most certainly not the time for such things and the brown-haired boy knew it. The younger boy looked down at the older, who was now finally able to get back to his feet since the grunt who had been pinning him quickly stepped away once Ash showed himself to be a threat. Hey there, Gary. The messy-haired trainer eye-smiled and waved. Hope I'm not too late and missed out on all the fun yet. Well, maybe there was room for a joke or two after all. Gary, however, was nothing but serious as he narrowed his eyes and shook his head. Get out of here, Ash. These guys are tough, especially her. He then pointed towards Elenia and drew Ash's attention in said direction. Soon enough he laid eyes on the attractive blonde woman standing some ways off with a Vaporeon by her side. Or at least, he may have found her attractive if it hadn't been for the big red R on her chest. His eyes narrowed as he gazed upon her in silence until the woman finally spoke with a smirk on her supple lips and a hand upon her wide hip. So who are you, my little cutie? You're quite obviously a trainer if those 3 adorable Pokémon standing behind you are any indication. Did you come here just to hand them over to me personally, dear? Ash simply glared and spoke in an icy tone to combat the sickly sweet one she had just used. I'm here to stop you and the rest of your evil team. Either give back the Pokémon and everything else you've stolen, or else I swear. His fist clenched as he rose it up and jabbed it toward the woman like a threatening declaration. And his tone matched the seriousness of the gesture. You'll regret it. Elenia merely laughed. Oh really? You make me laugh, sweetie. Do you really think you can stop all of us? She gestured at all of the rocket agents scattered throughout the ballroom. The courageous young rookie seemed unfazed and confident as he met her challenging stare. I know I will. The buxom blonde shook her head and chortled to herself before flipping her hair. Well then, little man, show me what you can do. Ash raised up a trio of fingers. 3 on 3. She blinked in surprise for a moment before smirking again. My, quite the risk taker, aren't we? I like that in a man, shame you're just a child. Elenia closed her eyes for a moment, but when she opened them again there was a fierce gleam burning within her irises. But if you're so eager to lose, I'll happily help get you there faster. She then swiftly drew 2 new Pokeballs from the stylish belt wrapped around her skirt and held them between 2 feminine fingers. Ninetales, Vileplume, show this kitty why you shouldn't mess with a beautiful but deadly flower. With her threat given, she released the aforementioned 2 Pokémon, who appeared in twin flashes of bright light and stood on either side of Vaporeon. Ash, on his end, became wholly serious as he looked at his 3 chosen Pokémon. Let's go, guys. I know you can beat her, just believe in yourselves and trust each other, got it? Charmander, Squirtle and Bulbasaur nodded and jumped forward, more than ready for battle as they took their positions. Gary, who thought his one-time friend was completely out of his mind, nonetheless backed away while Ash's friends watched with anxious tension, locking them in place right where they stood. Everyone else in the ballroom, passenger and rocket alike, had all eyes on the impending battle while, up on the balcony, Zetson's eyes widened as he recognized Ash, leading him to yell down to his fellow commander. Elenia. Don't underestimate this kid, he's the same one who got in our way at MT. Moon. He beat me, remember? The rogue beauty flipped her again and laughed sardonically. I could care less, you whining fool. You and I are not even in the same league, this child will not be able to touch us. Her head snapped back to the present matter before her as she rose a manicured hand. Let's begin then. Ninetales use Flamethrower. Vileplume, Petal Dance and Vaporeon use Water Pulse. Ash was quick to respond. Squirtle use Water Pulse on Flamethrower. Charmander use Flame Burst to avoid Water Pulse and stop Petal Dance, and Bulbasaur use Razor Leaf on Vaporeon. Charmander quickly jumped in front of Squirtle, smoothly avoiding the incoming sphere of water, and then charged toward the glowing storm of brightly colored leaves while shrouded in a bright cloak of fire. While his teammate effectively burned through the leaves that had been sent toward him, Squirtle launched his own aquatic sphere at Ninetales' Flamethrower, causing an immediate explosion as both attacks cancelled the other out. Bulbasaur, meanwhile, fired Razor Leaf at Vaporeon, but Elenia was swift in commanding her evolved Eevee to use Aqua Tail and knock the leaves away, which she was easily able to do by quickly forming a cyclone of water on her tail and spinning around to clash with the incoming volley of leaves. The female rocket commander wasted no time. Ninetales used Takedown. Vileplume used Sweet Scent and Vaporeon, Ice Beam. Squirtle used Rapid Spin combined with Water Pulse to stop Ninetales from getting at Bulbasaur. Ash yelled while fluidly giving similar commands to the other 2 within seconds of one another. Bulbasaur get behind Charmander and Charmander, use Ember to beat back Ice Beam and Sweet Scent. He knew the most important thing was neutralizing Sweet Scent, which could be disastrous should such an attack take effect on his Pokémon. Squirtle jumped into the air, retracting into his shell while spinning toward Ninetales, spouting water all the while. This succeeded in halting the Vixen's headlong charge and resort to evasive maneuvering instead as she attempted to avoid getting hit by the turtle's water blasts. Bulbasaur himself jumped behind Charmander, and just as the small fire type opened his mouth and unleashed a powerful, circular ring of flames at the two incoming attacks. Thankfully, the flames indeed started to neutralize the pleasantly smelling spores of Sweet Scent and was even managing to hold its own against the cold beam of ice. Suddenly, Alania called out to Ninetales. "Stop running from that annoying little turtle and meet it head-on with your tails." Ninetales abandoned its defensive strategy and turned around instead to face the spinning water type that was heading right for it. Then, utilizing greater size and a sudden burst of speed, the fiery fox met Squirtle's spin head-on with a hard swing of its 9 tails. This not only succeeded in stopping the turtle's forward momentum but also sent him hurtling toward the ground and popping out of his shell as soon as he hit the hard wooden floor. Now use Flamethrower against that puny little salamander's candle flame. Immediately doing as she commanded, Ninetales opened its mouth and fired a powerful blast of flames at Charmander's much smaller and weaker one. The pre-evolved form of Charmeleon turned up the power and tried to fight back, but Ninetales' own attack simply gained more and more ground. Just as the stronger jet of fire was about to overwhelm him, Charmander suddenly opened his eyes wide and cried aloud, "Char!" as the flames coming from his mouth became bigger, hotter and much more powerful. Ash's own eyes widened for just a moment seeing this before an excited grin came upon his face and he cheered, realizing that Charmander himself had finally learned Flamethrower. Alania looked shocked as she saw her Ninetales Flamethrower now getting overpowered by Charmander's own, inexplicably stronger one. Therefore, she quickly commanded her Pokémon to disengage and jump away to avoid a messy outcome. Thankfully for it, Ninetales hopped out of the way as told and did so just as Charmander's own overwhelming jet of fire had completely overpowered and consumed its own. Vileplume, unfortunately, was not so lucky and got caught in the red-hot flames of the intense stream of fire since it had been standing almost directly behind Ninetales. Now, lit like a burning candle wick, the panicking grass type fell to the floor and started rolling around wildly in an attempt to put itself out. Thankfully for the evolved form of Gloom, however, Vaporeon quickly turned and quenched the fire by soaking Vileplume with a well-placed dousing of water gun. Her Pokémon were so well trained that Alania needed to give no command for such an action. Vileplume, however, remained on the floor even after the fire had been quenched. Ash, not one to let up, kept their momentum going by yelling out, "Bulbasaur, use Vine Whip and hold Ninetales in place." He then looked over at Squirtle, who was just standing back up after his earlier whacking. Squirtle used Water Pulse to cap it off. Bulbasaur wasted no time and shot his vines forth at Ninetales. Alania, however, wasn't about to let that happen and countered swiftly. Vaporeon used Ice Beam on those vines. Ash met her pound for pound, all the spectators in the ballroom now transfixed by their battle. Charmander used Flamethrower to melt Ice Beam. Charmander made expert use of his new and far more powerful attack for, just as Vaporeon sent forth a freezing beam of ice at the vines Bulbasaur now had heading for Ninetales, Charmander released a torrent of fire that easily overcame the freeze-inducing move. Alania's eyes narrowed and her face actually crinkled up for a moment as she cursed and had to think fast. Drat. Ninetales used Quick Attack to keep away from those vines. In a bright flash of yellow light, the cream-colored fox started to run in a zigzag, twisting and turning pattern in order to avoid getting caught by Bulbasaur's vines. Unknowingly though, she had just unintentionally placed her Pokémon right in Squirtle's range. Seeing his plan had worked, Ash smirked. Squirtle use Water Pulse right now. Neither Alania or Ninetales were prepared for it and that gave Squirtle all the opening he needed to launch a big sphere of aquatic energy at his target. Ninetales, unable to dodge in time, took the attack broadside and was sent tumbling across the floor with a pained cry of, "9." Ash wasted no time and called out another command. Charmander use flamethrower at Vaporeon and Squirtle use another water pulse. Elenia, feeling the boy had tripped up, jeered her younger opponent. Fire and water never mix and it's time you see why. Vaporeon use Aqua Tail to create a shield around yourself. Charmander's blast of flame and Squirtle's watery orb went speeding toward Vaporeon just as the aquatic mammal created a swirling vortex of water around its tail, which succeeded in shielding its entire body as Vaporeon angled her tail downward. While both attacks struck the watery defense and were effectively neutralized, the power of the combo maneuver managed to disrupt the aquatic defense and cause it to fall. Ash then seized that single moment as an ideal opportunity. Bulbasaur used Vine Whip to hold Vaporeon in place and then get in close and slam it while using Razor Leaf. Bulbasaur shot his vines out again and zipped across the room before swiftly wrapping themselves around the Uaware Vaporeon's midsection. Immediately, while his opponent struggled, Bulbasaur charged toward the evolved form of Eevee with all haste while simultaneously firing a dangerous swarm of leaves at her. Each and every leafy projectile hit their mark and caused Vaporeon to cry out in pain just as Bulbasaur reached her and threw himself straight into the slightly bigger Pokémon. At the same time, he also loosened his vines from around her and allowed Vaporeon to go free as the hit sent her soaring through the air. Finally, she ended up crashing straight into Vileplume and Ninetales, who were still laying on the floor themselves. Bulbasaur, Squirtle and Charmander quickly regrouped in front of their trainer while Elenia's Pokémon slowly stood back up. All three of them looked across between hurt and greatly angered. Vileplume was slightly burnt from the flamethrower she had taken so directly while Ninetales' glossy fur was totally soaked from Squirtle's water pulse. Vaporeon, on the other hand, just looked beaten up after suffering the onslaught Bulbasaur had wrought upon her. "See. I told you not to underestimate him." Zetsun yelled from up on the balcony while Riken simply stood next to him, beefy arms crossed and an utterly impassive look on his face. "Yeah, Ash, give it to her." Misty cheered, echoed by Giselle while Gary, not even 10 feet away from Ash, stared in disbelief at his fellow palette native. How is he doing so well when 3 of my strongest Pokémon couldn't even touch her Vaporeon? The brown-haired boy spoke just under his breath so only he could hear himself, but his eyes were trained on the calm, intently focused form of Ash. Well and truly in his natural element at the moment. Elenia actually gave a small growl as all traces of faux sweetness and playful flippancy vanished. "How dare you? You're going to pay for that, you little brat. No one hurts my Pokémon and gets away with it." She then looked over at her Vaporeon and firmly commanded in an angry tone, "Vaporeon, use Mist." Before Ash could do anything to stop it, the water type's entire body began to glow as she crooned an eerie sounding, "Va," in response to her trainer's order. Immediately thereafter, a thick white vapor started to emanate from her smooth, slick blue skin. "Darn it," Ash murmured under his breath as the entire ballroom slowly became filled with the increasingly thick, hazy fog until he couldn't see anyone else around him. Not even his Pokémon. Now blind to their surroundings, Squirtle, Bulbasaur and Charmander were left to see nothing but thick mist on all sides. Which did not but heighten their anxiety and put the 3 of them on high alert in the uncomfortable, heavy silence that seemed to drag on. Suddenly, and with no warning, they heard, "Water pulse now." From out of the impenetrable fog came speeding forth a globular sphere of water that struck Charmander straight in the chest. The fire-type Pokémon cried out and was launched back into the mist somewhere, totally vanishing from sight. Another shout of, "Petal Dance," came right on the heels of the last and within seconds, Squirtle was struck in the back of his shell by a storm of brightly glowing leaves. He too was sent rolling off into another unseen area of the ballroom with nothing but an outcry of, "Squirtle." The last thing Bulbasaur saw was a large shape barreling at him through the fog just before it smashed into him with great force. So great that it too sent him flying. Ash still couldn't see anything but he could hear Elenia's voice as she called out attacks, followed by the cries of his Pokémon as they were assaulted by whatever was being done to them. He was left being able to do nothing but stand and listen, helplessly, as he continually heard the same unpleasant noises on a seemingly tortuous repeat for what felt like an eternity. Elenia's voice was no longer being heard, but he wasn't surprised. This was likely a tactic she had trained her Pokémon to use in desperate circumstances if and when they were pushed to that point in battle. Instead, all he heard was the sounds of rushing feet, bodies hitting upon bodies, the easily distinguishable noises of energy attacks being utilized and, worst of all, the ceaseless cries of his Pokémon as they were victimized and assaulted from within the hellish prison of mist. Fists clenching and teeth gritting, his mind ran on double time as he tried to think of some way to turn the tides. And finally, after delving through his strategic recesses, Ash's eyes widened as a wild idea came to him. Charmander. He yelled with hands cupped over his mouth. Can you hear me? Somewhere within the thick fog, Charmander heard his trainer's call just as he was struck by yet another hidden aqua tail from Vaporeon. It took all of his recent training to endure so many painful, repeated aquatic attacks without succumbing, but, after struggling back to his feet, breathing heavily, Charmander called out in response. Char. Charmander char char. Ash smiled in relief, he wasn't too late. And with that knowledge he yelled loud enough to be heard again. Charmander, listen. I need you to get the flame on your tail as hot as you can and then aim a flamethrower up toward the ceiling. And don't keep it in one place. Charmander nodded and then focused on his tail flame as he channeled all of his energy into making it as hot as possible. Then, once he could feel it was at its height, the fire-natured salamander looked up at the ceiling with the intensity of the heat in his small body all but visible in his eyes. Finally, with a loud cry of, "Char!" he unleashed a truly massive stream of fire up at the ceiling and then immediately started to swivel his head this way and that, moving the roaring funnel of flames in every direction possible. It didn't take long of this before the atmosphere of the entire ballroom room, namely the mist itself, actually started to take on a bright red hue and also became extremely hot. So much so, in fact, that it got hard to breathe in. Due to the intense heat evaporating all of the moisture in the air, the mist itself slowly began to fade away a little at a time. Once the thick, foggy haze had finally dissipated, the proceedings of the battle were at last visible again. It was just in time too, since Ninetales was right in the midst of charging Bulbasaur again. However, since the badly beleaguered-looking grass type could finally see once more, he jumped out of the way of the incoming quick attack and used his vines to trip up his opponent. Which succeeded and caused the thwarted fire type to retreat after just barely regaining its footing. Vileplume was preparing to use Mega Drain on a very exhausted-looking Squirtle, but he saw it coming and his eyes widened. He had already been tortured and harassed by that very same attack several times while a prisoner in the misty cage he and his teammates had been trapped in. It was therefore due to a combination of adrenaline, anger and sheer, outright refusal to undergo the same torment again that Squirtle turned around just as his tail changed form. In a truly stunning turn of events, the small turtle's spiral tail suddenly transformed into a furiously spinning vortex of water. A twister that he unconsciously used to defend himself as he spun around and used it as a windbreaker against the leeching tendrils of Vileplume's Mega Drain. Which, just like Bulbasaur, ended up being an effective defense as the newly acquired move stopped said attack entirely. Charmander, for his part, was standing exactly where he had been, clearly exhausted after using such a powerful flamethrower and for so long a period of time. He even wobbled on his feet a little but stood strong regardless. Elenia herself appeared utterly dumbfounded that Ash had found a way to defeat her unbeatable mist tactic. But, to her credit, she didn't let that stop her from regaining her composure quite quickly. "I've had enough of you, brat," she fumed while narrowing her eyes in an icy, hate-filled glare at Ash and his Pokémon. She then rose her hands skyward and shouted, "Ninetales, use Fire Blast on that pathetic little weed of a grass type. Vileplume, use Solar Beam on his midget turtle, and Vaporeon, use Blizzard to teach that annoying Charmander a permanent lesson." Ash urgently called out to his three battle-worn Pokémon, who once more came together to stand side by side. "Are you guys ready to win this and send Team Rocket packing?" The spirited trio looked back at their trainer and nodded with steely determination remaining unbroken within their eyes. Squirt. Char. Bulba. Ash smiled proudly at their response. They may have been tired, hurt and fatigued, but they were not going to give up. They would win no matter the cost. Therefore, wanting to be worthy of their resolve as their trainer, Ash rose his fist. Then let's do this. All three of you huddle together. The mascot starter Pokémon of Kanto did as commanded and, taking a formation they had practiced quite a few times before now, the trio came together in a nearly perfect triangle. At the same time, Ninetales unleashed a giant blast of fire that took the shape of a flaming figure with arms and legs. Vileplume, likewise, lowered the flower petal on its head and finally released the beam of raw, natural, grass-type energy it had been gathering from the moment Elenia gave the order. And from Vaporeon's mouth came a freezing blast of sub-zero ice and snow that grew larger and larger the farther it traveled across the ballroom. Just before all three mighty finishing moves could reach their targets though, Charmander suddenly opened his mouth and discharged an inky black smoke. The thick haze came to settle over he and his teammates and completely concealed them from view just as the elemental attacks of fire, earth and ice made contact. Immediately, a massive explosion rocked the entire ballroom that caused everyone to close their eyes, cover their heads and look away while the cloud of smoke created by it was greater than that which Charmander had produced. When the chaos and calamity of the great blast finally calmed and everyone in the ballroom was able to look again, all eyes waited anxiously for the smoke cloud itself to finally dissipate. Elenia, in the meantime, relaxed her stance and put a hand on her hip while smirking triumphantly at her younger opponent. I told you that you and your weakling Pokémon stood no chance against me, little boy. She then turned and pointed at everyone else in the crowd. Do you see? This is what happens when you resist Team Rocket. Humiliation and defeat. While the people seemed to all lose what little hope they had left, the Rocket agents all crowed in triumph. Up on the balcony, Zetsun smirked and crossed his arms. Well, the kid held out longer against her than I would have imagined, but the results aren't surprising. I'm glad he finally got a taste of what he did to me back at MT. Moon. Ash's friends, meanwhile, were gaping in horror at what they had just seen. Oh no. Giselle gasped with her hands folded over her mouth. There's no way those three could have endured something like that. Misty's eyes were set to an unsteady waver as she noticed the smoke cloud was almost gone. Brock's thin eyes were trained on their friend however as he spoke in a contemplative manner. I'm not so sure you two, look at him. Misty and Giselle both looked at their youngest friend and shared romantic interest and were surprised to see no emotion whatsoever on his face. Instead, he was merely staring intently at the center of the ballroom where the source of the smoke was the last to clear. He doesn't look worried or upset at all. Giselle furrowed her brow in confusion while Misty's own face screwed up to reflect a visage of great intrigue. Yeah, what's the deal? Brock shook his head. I don't know, let's just see what happens before we jump to any conclusions. Back up on the balcony, Zetsun now appeared completely calm again as he folded his hands behind his head. Hey, I knew that runt stood no chance against Elenia. Heck, I bet the only reason he beat me is because I was more worried about my hair getting messed up in that damp old cave. Some rookie kid actually beating a Team Rocket commander fair and square. Yeah, right. Riken finally spoke in his low and gravely voice. Of course he could never beat her. He's nothing more than a child pretending to be a hero. This was a waste of time, we should be back at base right now reporting the success of our mission to Giovanni. Not wasting our time battling snot-nosed brats. The lazy-looking younger man just gave the big bruiser a blank look. You really need to get a day off or something, man. You take life way too seriously, learn to live a little. He finished with a smirk and a nonchalant sigh. Riken merely glared at his younger cohort in response, leading Zetsun to hold his hands up in a sign of surrender. Or not, whatever floats your boring, dull old boat, Mr. No Fun. Back down on the main floor, Gary shook his head and looked away from his rival. I knew he couldn't beat her. If I couldn't do it, then there's no way someone like Ash could. Even if he did put up a heck of a fight. Elenia settled her eyes on Ash and, seeing him staring with unbroken concentration at the spot in which his Pokémon would soon be revealed, took that moment to taunt him further. What's wrong, sweetie? Upset your puny little Pokémon or what the? Her jeering came to an immediate end and swiftly gave way to outright shock as the smoke finally cleared away completely and revealed that which baffled everyone in the entire hall. Even the usually emotionless Riken allowed himself to show genuine surprise as his own eyes widened. What is that? Giselle exclaimed in amazement. I've never seen anything like it before. Misty murmured under her breath, just as awestruck as the other girl. Neither have I. Brock muttered in perfect harmony with the other two. Is that some kind of attack? From over in his spot that was nearest to Ash, Gary made no attempt to hide the great intrigue he too felt at the sight before his eyes. What in the name of Articuno's tail feathers? Zetson beat his hands upon the banister railing on the balcony, leaning over so far in his outburst that he started to flail his arms as he almost fell over. There, in the center of the ballroom, was a small dome of swirling fire. It was wildly and furiously spinning about in all directions, but somehow it was also perfectly controlled and stable. As if it were nothing but a flame burning on the end of a matchstick. The fire slowly began to die down eventually, and when it did, another amazing spectacle was seen. This time it was a dome of water, rotationally spinning around like a sphere of liquid kept in precise control by a masterful psychic type. Even more amazing considering that the aquatic dome had apparently been active while under the one of fire. Slowly, the water dome also began to slow in its rotation and then, abruptly, stopped spinning altogether before splashing to the floor. Underneath of the water dome, however, was an even still more amazing sight. And that was all three starter Pokémon huddled against one another with a